The Mormon apologist Jacob Hansen was recently given the opportunity to debate prominent atheist Alex O'Connor in a Jubilee 1 versus 25 video, where Hansen took the opportunity to present a somewhat controversial claim.
The restored gospel, also known as Mormonism, provides a conception of God that is more rationally defensible than any other creedal Christian sect.
This is definitely an interesting assertion. But is it a true one? In this video, I will point to the one big problem I see with the Latter-day Saint conception of God. The fact that what Mormons call God isn't really God at all. But before I get into that, I do want to clarify something first. I've noticed sometimes Christians tend to jump on Mormonism a bit too much, as if it's an especially absurd religion that no one should bother engaging with. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I do have problems with Mormon philosophy that I don't have with some other religions, like Protestantism or Islam, and I'll be getting into those in a second. But I have no particular animosity towards Mormonism, and definitely not towards Mormons themselves. So what is this big problem I see with Latter-day Saint theology? I said earlier that what Mormons call God isn't actually God, but let me explain what I mean by that. It's not really a secret that Mormons believe that God is able to change. After all, Mormonism teaches that God was once a human being like us, and then he became God. There's an oft-repeated couplet summarizing the teaching of Mormon founder Joseph Smith that reads, "As man now is, God once was. As God now is, man may be." So for Mormons, God was once a man, and now he's not. So God changed. But why is this a problem? Christianity has classically taught that God is unchanging. Part of the reason for this is scriptural, but another part of it is philosophical. After all, we know that faith cannot contradict reason. If we want to claim that something is true from faith, then whatever we're claiming can't go against what we know from reason. And it just so happens that there are good, rational reasons to think that God is unchanging. In fact, all of the best classical arguments for the existence of God establish not just the existence of God, but the existence of an unchanging God. Take Aristotle's famous argument from motion as an example. This argument starts with a super simple observation about the world. Change exists. We can't really deny that because we see things changing all the time. I move my hand from here to here. That's a change. I snap a pencil in two. That's another change. You subscribe to my YouTube channel. That's a change too, and it's a change for the better. You get the idea. Change is all around us. But change, Aristotle argued, is best described and best understood as the actualization of a potential. What he means here is that change doesn't entail something coming from nothing, but something coming from a kind of in-between phase between something and nothing that Aristotle calls potential. After all, if change was something coming from nothing, then change would have to be impossible, because something cannot come from nothing. So Aristotle argues that change is not something coming from nothing, but something coming from potential, which is not the same as nothing. Change is the actualization or the making fully real of a potential, which is already kind of real. But this raises a question. If change involves something potential being made actual, how does something get made actual? Does it make itself actual? This doesn't really make sense because you can't give yourself what you don't already have. So if you don't already have actuality, you can't give yourself actuality. So you must get your actuality from something else in order for your potentials to be made actual. So maybe you get your actuality from something else that was once potential and is now actual. That works at first until you realize that this thing, if it was once potential, must have been given its actuality from something else. And the question you can then ask is, what is giving this thing actuality? And you can keep on going back and asking what's giving actuality to all the potential things in the world. And if you keep saying that it's another thing that is part potential and part actual, you're not actually answering the question of how anything has actuality in the first place. So that leaves us with a dilemma. Either everything that exists derives its actuality from something else, in which case there's no explanation for the existence of actuality at all, or there's something which doesn't derive actuality from anything else, but which just has it of its own nature. A purely actual actualizer, something that actualizes other things without itself being actualized. And since the first option, the one that says that there's no explanation for the existence of actuality in the world, is absurd, because there is actuality in the world, then there must be a purely actual actualizer. And Christianity has historically identified this purely actual actualizer of Aristotle with God. The reason is that if you start digging into what a purely actual being would look like, it starts looking pretty godlike. A purely actual actualizer must be infinite, for example, because to be finite is to lack something. And if you lack something, you have the potential to gain that thing you lack. So the purely actual actualizer must be infinite. And to be truly infinite is to have all perfections perfectly, including the perfections of all goodness, knowledge, and power. So to be purely actual is to be all good, all knowing, and all powerful. And if this thing is all knowing, it's personal, since only persons can have knowledge. And since the purely actual actualizer is responsible for the existence of everything that changes, which is everything except itself, the purely actual actualizer can be said to be the personal cause responsible for all that is. So we have this infinite, all good, all knowing, all powerful personal cause of all that is. If that's not God, I'm not sure what is. But here's the catch. If it's not clear from what I've said already, a perfectly actual being must also be unable to change. To change, we said, is to actualize a potential. And if a purely actual actualizer had any potential, it wouldn't really be purely actual. And there would have to be some other purely actual thing that actualized its potential. And that other purely actual thing would not be able to change. So however you slice it, there must be a purely actual actualizer that can't change. This is a big problem for Mormonism, because as we've already said, Mormonism teaches that God can change. But it does get worse than that. You see, Mormonism also teaches that God has a physical body. Joseph Smith once wrote that the Father has a body of flesh and bones as tangible as man's. So God has a physical body in Mormonism, but a purely actual being cannot have a physical body. To have a body requires a being to be made out of matter, since physical bodies are material by definition. But matter is constantly in flux, constantly changing in tiny microscopic ways. To be made out of matter is necessarily linked to being able to change. So for a traditional Christian, God can't change, because that would mean he's not purely actual. He also can't have a body, because that would mean that he's able to change. Mormons believe that God is changeable and that he's material. So Mormons just don't believe that God is purely actual, which is a problem if you think Aristotle's argument for motion works. If Aristotle's argument is sound, it disproves Mormonism just as much as it does atheism. And it's not just this one argument for God either. Most of the classical arguments for God arrive at a being who is unchanging and immaterial, and therefore not compatible with the Mormon conception of God. The argument from contingency, for example, claims that there must be a single necessary infinite being to explain the existence of contingent things in the world, and that this being is God. But if God is necessary, he must be unable to change, because being able to change means that you're not necessarily the way you are right now. You could be different. Neither is Mormonism compatible with the argument from morality, which says that God must be an unchanging standard of truth and goodness to account for the existence of objective moral truths. Because if God's nature is able to change, he can't be an unchanging standard. Even something like the Kalam cosmological argument, which argues that there must be a first cause of the universe to explain its beginning in time, only works if God is immaterial. Because if he's not, how can he create the material world? You can't create something if you're part of that something. The fact is that Mormons just don't accept the classical understanding of God. So they can't accept the classical arguments for God. And as someone who has made it the goal of my career to defend those classical arguments for God, I can't accept Mormonism. Latter-day Saint doctrine just doesn't coincide with what we know about God from philosophy. Maybe a Mormon might want to reject these arguments and formulate his own philosophical arguments for what he calls God. But as someone who is firmly committed to the success of the classical arguments for God, I'm going to oppose Mormonism for the same reason I oppose atheism. It just doesn't have sufficient answers to the questions posed by these philosophical arguments. Now, I do want to cover one final point before ending this video. Perhaps someone might want to push back against my claim that God can't be material. After all, doesn't Christianity teach that God became material in the person of Jesus Christ? And the clarification we need here is that while Christianity teaches that the second person of the Holy Trinity picked up, in a sense, a human nature in the person of Jesus Christ, there was no merging of the two natures. Jesus of Nazareth was really fully human and fully divine, not partially human and partially divine. His divine nature is unchanging, and his human nature is changing, but the two natures are not the same thing. Jesus has a body in his human nature, but not in his divine nature. One person, two natures, united in a somewhat mysterious thing we call the hypostatic union. That's the traditional Christian view, which is much more rationally defensible than the idea that the divine nature is itself a body. But again, I mean no animosity towards any Mormons watching this video right now. I'd rather have an alliance on the things we agree with than fight about the things we disagree with. But I have to point out error where I see it. But regardless of where you're coming from, and even if you disagree with the argument I presented in this video, I hope you'll like the video and subscribe to my channel, if only so that I can keep making content to move the intellectual conversation on these subjects forward. Thank you for watching this video, and God bless.